Welcome to Module 3, Policy and Implementation Mechanisms. In this section, we will dig deeper into the first 5 steps for improving the prevention and management of conflicts of interest which involve policy and implementation mechanisms. Step 1 involves establishing a working group to plan and prioritize actions. Some countries may already have a group in place that focuses on strengthening governance in pharmaceutical or health systems that could take on this task. An important starting point for the working group is to identify the most critical gaps and weaknesses, and then prioritize the pharmaceutical processes, decisions, and actions that have a greater risk of conflict of interest situations arising or causing harm. High-risk areas depend on the local situation and context. However, some are common across countries, particularly those that rely on discretionary decision-making such as public procurement, selection decisions and awarding of licenses. Risks can be identified by consulting staff, committee members and external contacts, reviewing records, complaints and whistleblower reports, and reviewing media coverage of conflict of interest issues. Step 2 involves a review of any existing legislation, policies, rules and codes of conduct, and then development or revision as needed. Firstly, a mapping exercise should be undertaken to identify the relevant national policies and legislation, and any regional and international treaties that pertain to the prevention and management of conflict of interest. The review should include the presence and functionality of the bodies responsible for administration, monitoring, oversight and enforcement, and also include any requirements for transparency, accountability mechanisms, and protection of whistleblowers. If policy or legislation does not exist or is inadequate, it should be developed, or revised as needed. Conflict of interest policies should be comprehensive, proportionate, accessible to the individuals and institution that may be affected by them, equally applicable to all individuals within an institution or a committee, regardless of seniority, and reviewed periodically to ensure that the policies are focused on the most important areas of risks. The supporting legislative and policy framework should emphasize preventive policies and procedures rather than relying on corrective and punitive responses alone. Contain provisions for disciplinary measures and actions, such as prosecution when breaches occur. Let's look at some common components of a conflict of interest policy. These may include the objective of the policy and the guiding principles and values, the scope of the policy and who it applies to, an agreed definition of conflict of interest and the primary interest or obligation, requirements for disclosure, guidelines on sponsorship of institutional or committee activities, procedures for record-keeping and making declarations public, the validity period and frequency for reviewing the policy, references to relevant legislation, policies, and guidance, provisions for oversight and enforcement, legal sanctions, and procedures for appealing decisions. Additional components relevant for the local context or the specific committee may be needed. Step 3 involves educating, providing guidance and raising awareness. Committee members and experts who advise the government on pharmaceutical policies and practices need to have a clear and shared understanding of what constitutes a conflict of interest in their specific decision-making processes, and for their particular role. To teach others about conflict of interest, responsibilities and resources for training need to be assigned. Training plans should be made to educate committee members, expert advisors, and the officials responsible for executing the policy. Training should be conducted at regular intervals for new staff and newly appointed committee members and advisors. Sharing information on the existence of the policy and its key provisions is important to make all concerned aware of their responsibilities, including senior managers, public officials and experts working as committee members, pharmaceutical industry representatives, and civil society group. Step 4 involves establishing oversight and enforcement mechanisms, and monitoring policy implementation. Periodic monitoring is required to ensure that conflict of interest policy remains relevant and that its implementation is effective, proportionate, fair, transparent, and accountable. Important considerations for monitoring, oversight, and enforcement mechanisms include making sure that responsibilities are assigned for reviewing, evaluating, and managing disclosed interests, and enforcing rules and sanctions. Establishing complaint, or whistleblower mechanisms, along with appropriate protections for whistleblowers. Definition of consequences such as fines, disciplinary actions, or restrictions on future engagement, for those who fail to declare secondary interests, or report false information. Implementation of conflict of interest policies should be reviewed periodically, to ensure that it is focused on the most important conflicts of interest, and is not unduly burdensome to implement or comply with. Monitoring should check that training, reporting, monitoring, and oversight are in place and functioning effectively. Finally, monitoring should check that the policy is being implemented fairly, transparently, and consistently. The last step in policy and implementation mechanisms is Step 5. Promote a culture of disclosure or ethical conduct. Codes of conduct or ethics are rules for activities and behaviors such as accepting gifts from the pharmaceutical industry. They can help to promote compliance with conflict of interest policies, and create an institutional culture that promotes desired values. Open discussions with committee members on measures to safeguard the integrity of decision-making, encouraging members to disclose and discuss conflicting interests, and involving them in a review of the institution's or committee's conflict of interest policy and practice can promote a culture of disclosure. We appreciate your kind attention to Module 3, Policy and Implementation Mechanisms. In the next module, we will be discussing the next 5 steps for improving the prevention and management of conflicts of interest.